Welcome, dear friend, to Marwood Hall, and if this story finds you at the close of a long day, we are very glad you are here. Do settle yourself, and let November 1817 carry you gently away. If the quiet pleasures of this channel suit your evenings, a kind subscription would mean the world to us. But for now, let us begin. November had come to Marwood Hall the way it always came, not as an arrival, but as a slow withdrawal of warmth, a tide pulling the last colour from the elm avenue and leaving the stone of the house to stand exposed against a sky the colour of pewter. The hall itself was old, older than the title it bore, and in the manner of old houses it had long since acquired opinions of its own. Its corridors breathed cold, drawing the chill in from the fields each morning, and releasing it only reluctantly toward noon, so that candles on passageway tables guttered even when every door stood closed, as though the house itself exhaled. The great windows at the east end of the library held frost at their corners from September through until March, and the glass between gave back a distorted image of whatever stood before it, a leaded, watery reflection, the world seen through ice. It was, in its bones, a house that had waited too long for its master. It had grown accustomed to a particular variety of silence, the silence of rooms kept clean without being used, of fires lit each morning in cold grates from habit and nothing more. Into this silence Charlotte Reeve, or Charlotte Marwood, as she had been these 18 months past, though she still sometimes caught herself forgetting, moved with a quietness entirely her own. She was 26, and plain in the way that people sometimes mean composed. Her face settled naturally into a still expression that strangers occasionally misread as severity and friends knew as patience. She had arranged herself in the library that grey Tuesday morning with unhurried precision. The books along the southern wall had been catalogued in her first month at Marwood Hall, and she was now working through a second pass, correcting the annotations of a previous cataloguer who had confused the third and fourth volumes of a parliamentary record set with a confidence entirely disproportionate to his accuracy. She worked with her back to the fire and her right hand moving steadily down a column of faded ink, and she was, to all visible evidence, content. The staff spoke in low and careful tones of the master's return. Charlotte had noticed it as one notices a change in the quality of light, not with alarm but with attention. Mrs. Ellard, the housekeeper, had folded her hands and used the particular phrase he has been through, much in the way that people use such phrases when they know more than they will say. The footman had remarked to no one in particular that the colonel was not a man who brought his sorrows forward in company, which Charlotte had found both informative and slightly foreboding. She did not hold it against any of them, the careful speech, the lowered voices. She simply listened and revised her mental preparation accordingly. She was the colonel's wife. She had been so for a year and 6 months in the legal and ecclesiastical senses that mattered, though she had met Colonel Lord Julian Marwood on precisely no occasions to date. The marriage had been arranged between her father's solicitor and his lordship's man of business, while his lordship was posted to the continent on diplomatic concerns. She had signed the papers at a table in Lincoln's Inn with rain against the windows, and the ceremony itself had taken place by proxy in a cold church in Northamptonshire, while the groom remained in France. There had been letters of a formal and business-like character pertaining to the management of the estate. There had been nothing else. He was, in every particular that concerned the private life, a stranger. She heard the wheels on the gravel at 2:45 in the afternoon, when the light had already begun to grey at the edges of the park. The sound came clear through the tall window, the crunch and slide of carriage wheels on the frost-hard drive, the clipped report of horses brought to a stop, a single voice giving a low instruction. Charlotte set down her pen and looked at the page before her. She straightened it needlessly, as the paper was already straight. Then she stood, smoothed the skirt of her grey wool dress with one careful motion, and looked toward the door. From the entrance hall below came boots on stone, a murmur of welcome from Mrs. Ellard, and then a silence in which the whole house seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. Charlotte turned back to her desk. She picked up her pen, set it down again, and sat with her hands folded on the open catalogue. She did not go to the door. The library door opened without announcement. Charlotte Reeve did not startle. She had schooled herself against starting at small sounds in the week since her arrival at Marwood Hall, but she did set her finger between the pages and raise her eyes, and in doing so met, for the first time, the gaze of her husband. Colonel Lord Julian Marwood was not as she had imagined him from the steward's careful, cautious portraits of his character. He was lean in the manner of a man who had not eaten well for a long time and had since forgotten to compensate. His coat was dark and plain, the dress of a man who dressed to go unremarked. A scar ran along the left side of his jaw from ear to chin, not roughly healed, but precisely so, the kind of wound that had been tended with some skill in a place where skill was available, which told her something of the postings he had kept. None of this, however, was what she noticed first. What she noticed first was that he did not look at her when he entered. He looked at the room. His eyes moved across the shelves, the fireplace, the two windows giving on to the west lawn, the pair of chairs drawn near the hearth, and only then, when the space had been read and, apparently, found acceptable, did his gaze come to rest upon her. It was not a long examination. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and his expression throughout was entirely neutral, but Charlotte understood it with the clarity she might have brought to a sentence in a language she had studied young and not forgotten. This was a man who had learned to audit a room before he trusted what was in it. The understanding carried neither judgment nor pity. It simply settled in her the way a fact does when it is met without resistance. He crossed to the centre of the room and bowed. She rose and curtsied, and the introductions were performed with a courtesy that was scrupulous and without warmth. Two strangers speaking the lines required of them by a contract signed 18 months prior, in separate rooms, by separate proxies in the absence of either party's preference for the arrangement. Lord Marwood said that he trusted she had been made comfortable. Charlotte said that she had, and thanked him, and asked whether she might call for tea. He declined, with a brief precision that was not unkind, only economical. A pause settled over the room, filling the space left by pleasantries that neither of them was inclined to manufacture. The fire spoke softly in the grate. Outside, the November garden held its silence, the bare linden trees standing in it like patient witnesses. Then he said, in the tone of a man who asks a question while looking at something else, what was it she had been reading? Charlotte noted that his gaze had moved to the volume in her hand, not to her face, as though the question were addressed to the book and she were only its keeper. She was aware, with a small and private clarity, that it was not an idle question. There was something in the angle of it, something careful and deliberate, that had the quality of a thing disguised as conversation. She did not mind this. She had expected something of the sort. A man who read a room before he spoke to the people in it was a man who read everything before he committed to an opinion, and she found she could not fault the logic of it, whatever discomfort its practice might occasionally occasion. She held the volume out without hesitation or apology. He took it and turned it to read the spine and opened it at the page she had marked. It was a treatise on agricultural improvement, written in French, published in Paris in 1803, a methodical examination of drainage schemes for heavy clay soils, concerned in its present chapter with the management of standing water in low-lying fields. His eyes moved across the French text with an attention that was immediate and particular, unhurried in the way that fluency allows, and he remained in that posture a moment longer than the length of the question seemed to require. Charlotte watched the candle on the side table throw its light across the page and across the lines of his face. She did not look away. She simply waited, as she had learned to wait for most things at Marwood Hall, without urgency, without expectation, with the quiet economy of a woman who had understood early in life that composure was the only currency that held its value in rooms where she was not quite wanted. He closed the book and returned it to her. He said nothing immediately regarding what he had read. The fire drew breath and exhaled in the chimney. At last he said, without inflection, that it was an unusual choice. Charlotte tucked the volume under her arm, met his eyes with an evenness she had decided upon before he entered the room, and said that the East Meadow drained very badly, and she had wished to understand why. 3 evenings after Colonel Lord Julian Marwood came to Marwood Hall, he passed the sitting-room door and saw his wife writing by candlelight. The hour was late, the rest of the house settled into its accustomed quiet, and yet there she sat at the small writing table near the window, her pen moving in long, unhurried strokes across the page, a single candle set close beside her hand, the flame barely sufficient for the work she gave it. She did not hear him pause. She did not lift her eyes. She wrote as a woman writes when she believes herself entirely alone, with a patience that has no audience and requires none. Julian stood a moment longer than he ought to have done, and then he continued down the corridor. He told himself it was nothing. He did not quite believe it. The diplomatic posting that had occupied the 4 years of their separation had not been a comfortable one. He had been stationed in territories where information moved through the most ordinary channels, a merchant's bill of lading, a lady's correspondence, a sealed note passed at a supper table, and where 2 men he had trusted with his own welfare had proved, in the end, to be loyal to interests that were not his country's. He had come home from that posting with his honour intact, and his capacity for easy trust considerably diminished. He was not proud of what that posting had made of him. He was simply aware of it, the way a man is aware of an old wound that has healed imperfectly. It does not pain him in fair weather, but he knows where it is. The following morning he found occasion to speak with Mrs. Ellard. The housekeeper had managed Marwood Hall for 11 years and possessed the particular composure of a woman who has weathered more than one difficult season without complaint. Julian approached the subject with the care he gave to all things he wished not to appear to care about. He asked, in passing, whether Mrs. Marwood had many correspondents. Mrs. Ellard told him, without hesitation, that Mrs. Marwood wrote faithfully to her sister in Bath, Miss Anne Reeve, unmarried and in indifferent health, to whom Mrs. Marwood was deeply attached. The letters went out with the regular post. There was nothing irregular in it. Julian thanked her and said nothing further. He did not believe the explanation was insufficient. He could not, in honest examination, identify what evidence troubled him, because there was none. There was only a woman writing late by candlelight, with a steadiness of purpose that his disordered imagination had coloured in shades it had no right to use. He was ashamed of himself, and the shame was the particular kind that cannot be confessed because the confession would require him to articulate a suspicion he could not justify, a suspicion directed at a woman who had, in all observable particulars, done nothing to deserve it. Charlotte, for her part, knew none of this. She had written to Anne as she always wrote, at length and honestly, describing the gardens in their November quiet, the changes she had noted in the household since the summer, and, with more care than she gave the rest, the fact of Julian's return. She did not know what to say of him. She settled in the end on the observation that he seemed tired, and that he had been courteous, and that Marwood Hall felt, though she could not fully account for it, as though it were waiting for something it did not yet have a name for. She sealed the letter with a plain dark wax she kept for correspondence and set it with the morning post. She did not imagine that the direction had been observed from the doorway. She did not imagine that the pause of boots on a corridor floor had been anything more than the ordinary settling of a house at night. That fourth evening, when Julian came to the sitting-room at the customary hour, Charlotte rose without remark and brought a second candle from the mantelpiece. She set it on the table beside the first and returned to her chair. She offered no explanation. She had noticed on the evenings previous that the single candle cast an uneven light that left the far corner of the room in shadow, and it had seemed to her a simple thing to remedy. She was not making a gesture. She was not extending an invitation. She was attending, as she had always attended, to the small and practical business of making a room habitable. Julian received the second candle in silence. He did not thank her immediately. The words were slow in coming, slowed by something he could not name, and by the time he found them, she had already taken up her book, and the moment had the quality of a thing not quite begun. He set the candle where it would do the most good, and he sat, and the room was brighter than it had been the evenings before, and neither of them remarked upon it. Outside, the November wind moved through the grounds of Marwood Hall without particular urgency, turning the last of the leaves from the avenue trees and carrying the cold smell of rain not yet fallen. Inside, the two candles burned with a steadiness that the single one had never quite achieved. The atlas was one of the older volumes in the Marwood Hall library, its spine cracked with long use, and its pages foxed at the edges where damp had crept in during some winter of neglect before Charlotte's time. She had drawn it from the shelf on a Tuesday morning, when the frost lay unmelted along the south-facing sills, and the fire in the library had not yet been built to any satisfactory warmth, and she had carried it to the writing-table with the careful deliberateness of a woman who does not begin a thing without intending to finish it. The agricultural treatise lay open beside it, its French prose dense and particular, full of references to the lower Seine valley and the chalk plains that stretched inland from the Normandy coast, and Charlotte had grown in the habit of tracing those references to their proper ground, not from any longing for a country she had never visited, but from a thoroughness that was native to her, the same quality that kept her household accounts in two parallel columns, so that any error must show itself in both directions before she was satisfied. She moved her finger slowly along the river courses, pausing at the confluences, reading the small printed names of market towns and farming villages with a quiet concentration that asked nothing from the room and expected nothing in return. She was not aware that she was being watched. Julian stood in the doorway. He had come for a volume of maps he used when corresponding with his land agent about the northern boundary drainage, and he had arrived at the moment she turned a page and bent her head lower to read a particular name along the Belgian border, and something in the posture, the lowered head, the tracing finger, the unhurried and thorough attention, had stopped him where he stood, with a precision he could not have explained and did not attempt to. He was a man who had learned to notice things before he knew what he was noticing, and the image before him lodged itself in his mind the way significant images did during his years of diplomatic service, completely, without asking his consent, available for retrieval at whatever hour the mind chose to retrieve it. He knew the atlas. He knew the region of the page she studied. He had himself been posted in the spring of 1815 to a stretch of that border country in the uncertain weeks before the final campaign, and the names of towns on that page were not geographical abstractions to him, but places where intelligence had moved or failed to move, where a trusted man had spoken one thing and sent another. He could read 2 of those town names from where he stood, and Charlotte's finger rested near them both. He withdrew before she looked up. She did not hear him go. That evening the dinner table was set with the usual candles and the usual quiet, and the footman moved between them with the usual soft attentiveness, and Charlotte spoke of the kitchen garden drainage in her measured way, and Julian attended to what she said with the surface of his mind, while the rest of it held the image of the atlas with perfect stillness. He waited until the second course was removed and the footman had retreated to the door, before he asked, as though it had occurred to him pleasantly and without particular purpose, whether she had family connections to France or any acquaintance there. Charlotte considered the question without visible surprise, as she considered most things. She said that she had none, no family, no acquaintance, no connection of any kind. A fondness for the language she allowed, acquired in girlhood from a governess who had spent her early life in Tours, and who had taught French not as a drawing-room accomplishment, but as a living thing, with the rhythms of real speech and the vocabulary of ordinary life. The governess had been a particular favourite, Charlotte said, and the fondness for the language had outlasted her by many years. It was an honest answer. It was a complete answer. It accounted fully for the French agricultural treaties, for the ease with which she read the atlas's printed names, for whatever he might have heard of her speaking with Emile in the kitchen garden. There was nothing in it that a careful person could call evasive, and Charlotte was not a woman who evaded. Julian said that he understood, and thanked her mildly for satisfying his curiosity, and turned the conversation to the matter of the estate's northern fence posts, which required attention before the ground hardened further. Charlotte answered him on the fence posts with equal composure. Across the candles in the quiet room she looked as she always looked, contained, attentive, present, without insistence. He did not receive her answer as true. He did not receive it as false. He received it as a thing that fit too cleanly, and held it in the same place in his mind where the atlas already waited, and said nothing more, and passed her the salt. The writing desk in Charlotte's sitting room had a small brass lock, and she kept it fastened as a matter of long habit rather than concealment. Years ago, a cousin visiting Marwood Hall had discovered her private letters and read them aloud at the supper table, not maliciously, only thoughtlessly, with the careless confidence of someone who had never learned that other people's words were not public property. Charlotte had been 17, and the humiliation had settled into her quietly, the way a frost settles into ground, leaving something altered beneath the surface. After that she had kept the drawer locked. It was not a decision she revisited. It had simply become the shape of her days, as ordinary as drawing the curtains at dusk. She possessed nothing inside that drawer which the whole of England might not read without scandal, only her household accounts, a letter from her sister in Bath, and a small notebook in which she recorded what the kitchen garden required from one season to the next. The lock existed because the cousin had existed. It required no further explanation. Julian noticed it on the fourth morning. She did not see him notice. She had her back to the room, adjusting the fire, and when she turned, he had moved to the window with an expression of perfect neutrality. But she had the unaccountable sense that something had passed between them, some silent observation made and carefully filed away. She thought perhaps she had imagined it, for he said nothing, and in the days that followed he continued to say nothing. Watching, she understood now, though the watching was so quiet it was almost indistinguishable from ordinary domestic attention. He passed through the rooms of the house with the measured patience of a man in no hurry, finding nothing remarkable, because there was nothing remarkable to find. She mended the drawing-room curtain where the lining had separated. She wrote to her sister about a bolt of wool serge she had promised to source from the mercer in the village. She walked each afternoon to the kitchen garden and back, her boots leaving narrow prints in the frost that had settled across the paths since the second week of December. He accompanied her once on those walks, uninvited, falling into step beside her, without ceremony, and she had not objected, because she could not think of a reason that would not sound strange. The garden was dormant and beautiful in its way, the beds outlined by their low stone edges, the bare espalier pears spread flat against the south wall, the soil dark and wet from a fortnight of persistent cold. Julian walked beside her without speaking much, which she was beginning to understand was his natural mode, and she did not trouble him with conversation. On the frosty morning that changed something, she had gone to him directly. She knocked at the door of his study, which he had not yet fully occupied. The desk was clear, the papers that had arrived from London still stacked beside the chair rather than sorted, and she told him, without preamble, that she would be grateful for his opinion on the drainage in the lower beds. She explained that the north corner had been waterlogged since autumn, and that she wished to address it in spring before the planting began, but she was uncertain whether the solution she had in mind would require altering the existing stone edging. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said he would come. She had prepared a pencil sketch. She was not certain why she had thought to bring it, only that she had been working on it the previous evening, and it seemed easier than describing the problem with words alone. It was careful, rather than accomplished, a series of contour lines indicating where the ground rose and fell, with small annotations in her near hand, marking the depth of standing water after heavy rain. She spread it on the stone edge of the raised bed, and stood back to let him look. Julian studied it for longer than she expected. He asked 2 questions, one about the original drainage channel that ran along the west wall, and one about whether the condition had worsened in recent years or remained constant. She answered both without difficulty, because she knew the garden as she knew the household accounts, not because anyone had instructed her to, but because in his absence the estate had required someone to know, and she had been the person present. There was no performance in the way she answered him. She was not attempting to appear capable, nor was she attempting to conceal that she was capable. She simply told him what she knew, because he had asked. They walked back along the frost-hardened path in the thin morning light, and somewhere between the garden gate and the east door of the house, Julian forgot that he suspected her. It was only a few minutes, perhaps 5, perhaps less, during which he moved beside her through the cold air, and thought of nothing except the ground levels and the spring planting and the particular quiet that belongs to December mornings in Wiltshire. Then he became aware that he had forgotten, and the awareness returned him to himself with an unsettling abruptness. He had been watching for evidence of deception, and instead He had spent a quarter of an hour discussing drainage with a woman who managed his estate from a pencil sketch and the accumulated knowledge of years. He did not know what to do with that. He opened the door for her, and she thanked him, and they parted in the hall. Among the small household of Marwood Hall there was one soul whose loneliness Charlotte understood without effort. Émile Garnier had come to England in the last years of the previous century, carried westward by the same tide of terror that had swallowed so many quiet lives, and he had ended his wandering in the kitchen garden of a Wiltshire estate, coaxing turnips and espalier pears from English soil with patient, weathered hands. He was past 70 now, and the years had settled into the lines of his face like frost into bark. He spoke serviceable English when the work required it, but English was a coat he wore rather than a skin he inhabited, and there were hours when Charlotte could see the weight of it on him. The slow search for words, the slight withdrawal behind the eyes when conversation moved too quickly and left him stranded on its far bank. She had begun speaking French with him almost without deciding to. It had started with a word or two in passing. A small kindness offered the way one offers a chair to someone who has been standing too long, and it had grown by degrees into something that both of them depended upon without acknowledging it. In his own language, Émile became a different man, quicker, drier, possessed of a wry humour that his English self could not quite reach. He told her things in French he would never have managed in English. The name of the river that ran behind his father's house in Normandy, the particular quality of light in late September over the bocage, the smell of the boulangerie on the corner of the street, where he had been a boy. Charlotte listened. She had always been a good listener, and there was something in these small dispatches from a lost world that she received as though they were important, because they were. On a morning in mid-December, with the garden contracted to its winter bones and their breath rising white in the cold air, Émile pressed into her hands a folded square of paper. It had been worked over with some care, a hand-drawn map of his Normandy village, the streets inked in careful lines, the church marked with a small cross, the river indicated by a wavering curve that spoke of memory rather than surveying precision. His grandchildren had never seen the place where he was born, he explained, and he was not certain he would be given the years to take them. He wished Charlotte to copy it clean for him in her steadier hand, so that the lines would not fade, and the children might have something to hold. It was the request of a man who had made his peace with distance and was trying, in the only way remaining to him, to bridge it. Charlotte took the paper with both hands and told him she would see it done before the week was out. She did not hear the footstep on the gravel path beyond the yew hedge. Colonel Lord Julian Marwood had come into the walled garden for no particular reason. Habit, perhaps, or the restlessness that still visited him on cold mornings when his body remembered other winters in other countries, winters that had required attention to stay alive. He came around the corner of the hedge and stopped. What he saw lasted no more than 30 seconds. His wife and the old under-gardener, heads inclined, speaking in rapid, low French. A folded paper passing between their hands. The paper received, held, not immediately opened. He had spent 11 years reading scenes for their grammar. He had learned that deception rarely announced itself as deception. It wore the clothes of the ordinary, the unremarkable, the domestic. He knew what the grammar of concealment looked like, the lowered voice, the thing exchanged, the practiced ease of two people who have done this before. He knew this, and he saw it, and the fact that the woman at the centre of it was Charlotte, who had seemed to him in these weeks so perfectly herself, made no immediate difference to what his training read in the image before him. He withdrew before either of them looked up. He did not examine the grounds for an alternative account. He walked back through the kitchen garden and into the house and sat with the knowledge in the way he had taught himself to sit with incomplete intelligence, still, without resolution, waiting. At dinner that evening he was correct and civil and entirely sealed. Charlotte, seated across the candlelight, felt the change before she could name it, a quality of formality that had not been present at breakfast, a care in his attention that felt like withdrawal dressed as courtesy. She waited until the servants had withdrawn before she asked, quietly, whether she had somehow given offence. He looked at her across the table. He said no. The word was pleasant in its surface and closed in its interior, and it did not invite the conversation forward, and Charlotte, who had been well trained by life to recognize a door being shut with perfect politeness, did not press it. The candles burned. The conversation turned to the weather, to the ice expected by the week's end, to nothing of consequence. Julian passed her the salt when she did not ask for it. It was the most attentive thing he did all evening, and it told her nothing at all. Sunday arrived with the particular stillness that belongs to late November, when frost has not yet formed, but the air carries the cold promise of it, and the village church called its congregation with a bell, whose sound crossed the empty parkland and found Charlotte Reeve before she had reached the gate. She went alone as she had gone every Sunday since her arrival at Marwood Hall, walking the lane between bare hedgerows, with her prayer book held at her side and her bonnet ribbons loose in the grey morning. She had not asked whether Julian attended services. He did not. She had not remarked upon it. Some domestic silences, she had learned, were courtesies rather than failures, and she had grown practised at leaving space where questions might have crowded. She crossed the stile at the lane's end, and the hall receded behind her, its windows dark, its chimneys breathing thin white smoke into a colourless sky. Inside the hall, Julian heard her footsteps on the gravel diminish and then cease. He waited a further interval, long enough to be certain, not so long as to permit him to think better of what he intended. Then he went to find Mrs. Ellard. He found the housekeeper in the linen room, her expression steady as always, her hands occupied with folding. He offered a pretext that was thin enough to embarrass him in the offering of it, something about a paper mislaid, a document he believed Mrs. Marwood had agreed to locate for him, and Mrs. Ellard heard it without visible scepticism. She produced the spare key to the writing desk with the practised quiet of a woman who understood that the households of gentlemen required the smooth management of awkward moments, and Julian accepted it with a murmured word of thanks, and went to the morning room before either of them might dwell upon the exchange. The writing desk stood beneath the window that faced the frost-pale garden. He had passed it a dozen times without looking at it directly. He set the key in the lock, felt it turn, and opened the small upper drawer. What he found was not what suspicion had imagined. There were no letters in cipher, no diagrams, no evidence of correspondence with persons whose names might have appeared in the intelligence reports he had read during 3 years on the continent. There were letters, but they were domestic, a bundle of them, tied with a worn blue ribbon. The handwriting on the outermost envelope loose and familiar, the sender his wife's sister in Bath. Beside them lay a pressed flower, its colour long since faded to the particular brown of old paper, the kind of thing one preserves not for beauty, but because it was present at a moment worth keeping. Beneath the flower rested a small oval portrait, no larger than his palm, framed in plain gilt, a woman perhaps 50 years of age, painted with the careful attention of modest means, whose eyes bore a resemblance to Charlotte's that required no inscription to explain. He understood it to be Mrs. Reeve. He set the portrait down with more care than he had intended. The journal lay beneath it, green leather, the cover softened at the corners by handling, the pages filled with the same confident hand he had seen on the household accounts she left on the study table for his review. He knew, as he opened it, that he was doing something he could not undo. The entry he read had been written 4 days after his arrival at Marwood Hall. The date sat plainly at the head of the page. She had written of the house and of the way the east corridor held cold, of Mrs. Ellard's particular method of arranging the breakfast things, of a rook that had taken to sitting on the garden wall at the same hour each morning. And then she had written of him in sentences that were neither wounded nor resentful, nor careful in the way that people are careful when they are concealing something. She had noted his wariness. She had named it plainly, without cruelty, and without the softening that is sometimes crueler still. And she had written, in a hand that did not waver, "I hope he is not too unhappy to let kindness in eventually." He read no further. He closed the journal and returned it to its position, the portrait beside it, the pressed flower above, the letters in their blue ribbon resting as they had rested before his hands had disturbed them. He locked the drawer. He returned the key to Mrs. Ellard with another murmured word, and without meeting her eyes, though he suspected she would have met his without difficulty. He went to the library. The fire there had not been lit, and the cold settled around him as he sat in the chair nearest the empty grate, the light at the windows the pale grey of a Sunday morning that would not improve toward afternoon. He sat for a long time. He was not, he realized, thinking about intelligence or loyalty, or the question of what his wife might or might not be. He was thinking about an entry written in a green journal by a woman who had observed his unhappiness with clear eyes and wished him, simply, the possibility of something better. He heard her footsteps on the gravel before he had resolved what to do with that. They were unhurried, as everything about her was unhurried, and they came closer through the still air until he heard the front door open and the sound of the house settling around her return. 2 days passed before Julian permitted himself to act upon what he had found. 2 days in which he moved through Marwood Hall with the careful deliberateness of a man who knew that one wrong step might send him down into a darkness from which there would be no easy return. He attended to his correspondence. He reviewed the estate accounts. He sat in the library until the candles guttered and the fire sank to grey ash, and he did not allow himself to think of the folded paper, nor of the French hand that had written upon it, nor of Charlotte moving quietly along the corridor while he slept. And then, on the afternoon of the second day, he put on his greatcoat and walked out to the kitchen garden. He could not have said afterward precisely why he chose to go there, rather than to some other part of the grounds. He told himself it was the air, November air, cold and clean, carrying the smell of turned earth and the last of the season's rotting leaves. He told himself he wished to see how the beds had been set for winter. He did not tell himself anything about Emile. The old Frenchman was where he nearly always was, in the declining hours of the afternoon, seated upon an upturned crate near the cold frame, his back against the south-facing wall where a little warmth still gathered from the pale autumn sun, his clay pipe sending thin threads of smoke into the still air. He looked up when he heard Julian's boots on the gravel path, and he smiled the unhurried smile of a man who has long since ceased to be surprised by any turn the world might offer. Julian sat down upon a second crate, close enough that their voices need not carry far. For a moment neither of them spoke. The garden held its winter quiet around them. The distant sound of a cart on the lane beyond the wall, the soft complaint of a wood pigeon somewhere in the yew. Then Julian reached into his coat and produced the folded paper, and laid it upon his knee, and looked at the old man. He spoke in French. It was not elegant French. It was the French of campaign maps and dispatch riders and the occasional hurried conversation with a wounded officer in a field tent, but it was serviceable, and Emile received it with the courteous patience of a man accustomed to hearing his language treated roughly by those who meant well. Julian asked about the paper. He kept his voice level. He said only that he had come across it, and that he wished to understand what it was. Emile looked at the paper on Julian's knee, and then he looked at Julian's face with the same mild, unsurprised attention he gave to everything. And then he did something entirely unexpected. He laughed. It was a quiet laugh, an old man's laugh, rustling and warm. He reached into the pocket of his worn coat and produced a second sheet of paper, folded in the same manner, covered in the same careful hand. He held it out to Julian without ceremony. He explained, in the slow and patient French of a man who knows his listener must work for each word, that Mrs. Marwood had been helping him since before the master came home from the continent, that he had grandchildren in Normandy, 3 of them, the eldest no more than 8 years of age, and that he had not seen them since the wars drove him out of France some 25 years before, and that he had never, in all that time, learned to write with any confidence. His hands, he said, holding them up briefly for inspection, broad hands, scarred and stiffened by decades of labour, had always been better suited to the spade than to the pen. Mrs. Marwood came to him in the afternoons when she could be spared. She took down his words as he spoke them, slowly, finding the French with him when he could not find it in English. She read aloud to him the letters that came in reply, because his sight was no longer equal to small print, and the post from Normandy was written by his daughter-in-law in a hand that gave trouble even to younger eyes. And she drew small maps, Emile said. Here he smiled again, with unmistakable fondness, so that the grandchildren might find the places he described, the lane where he had grown up, the church where he had been christened, the river he remembered in summer. She had done this for more than a year. She had never mentioned it to anyone so far as he knew. She had simply come. Julian sat very still on the upturned crate. The November air moved across the garden in a long, slow breath, and the wood pigeon called once more, and then was silent. Something that had been held tight within him, some cold and knotted thing that he had not fully understood, was there until this moment began, very slowly, to release. It was like a frozen river giving ground in the first uncertain days of a thaw, not a sudden breaking, but a gradual yielding, a letting go. He thanked Emile. The old man waved the thanks aside with comfortable generosity and drew once more upon his pipe. Julian rose from the crate, folded both papers, the one he had brought and the one Emile had given him, and placed them in his coat pocket. He walked back across the kitchen garden and along the path toward the house, more slowly than he had come. At the rear door, he stopped. He stood there for a long time, his hand not yet upon the latch, looking at the wood grain of the door, as though it might tell him what he ought to say when he went in. He did not know yet, but the cold thing in his chest had loosened, and the evening was very quiet, and presently he went inside. The week that followed was not marked by any single revelation. There was no moment of sudden clarity, no dramatic turning point that Julian might later point to and say, "There, that was when everything changed." Instead, understanding arrived the way morning arrives in winter, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until the room is simply lighter than it was before. He had spent a fortnight watching Charlotte for signs of subterfuge, cataloguing her silences, measuring her hesitations. Now, without quite deciding to, he found himself watching her differently, not for what she concealed, but for what she revealed without knowing it. The household ledgers were the first thing that gave him pause. He had not intended to examine them closely. He had taken them from the estate desk on a Tuesday morning with every expectation of finding the careless overruns that a young woman new to a large house might naturally produce. A little too much spent on candles, perhaps, or an excess of linen ordered out of unfamiliarity with what was already stored. Instead, he found columns of meticulous, double-noted precision, each entry cross-referenced in a second hand that was clearly her own. Every quarter's expenditure was accounted for to the shilling. She had not once requested more allowance than the amount settled at their marriage. He set the ledgers down and stood for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. He did not know what he had expected. He was not certain now that his expectation had been fair. 2 days later he passed the still-room passage and heard her voice through the half-open door. She was speaking with Mrs. Ellard, and the housekeeper's tone was easy, in a way it had not been during the first weeks of Charlotte's arrival. They were counting the linen stores. Julian could hear the soft rhythm of sheets being lifted and set aside, and Charlotte was asking after the kitchen-maid Mary, who had been unwell since the previous Thursday. She asked after the girl by name. She asked whether the fever had broken, whether the kitchen had managed without strain, whether Mary had been given broth rather than salt provisions until she was stronger. Mrs. Ellard answered with the warmth of someone who has been asked a question that mattered to them, and Julian stood in the passage a moment longer than he needed to before continuing on his way. He did not mention having heard it. On the Friday morning he went to the library for the County Agricultural Survey, a dull volume he kept meaning to consult regarding the Eastfield drainage problem that had gone unresolved for, at minimum, 2 years. He had spoken to the land steward about it the previous autumn, and found the man competent but cautious, unwilling to commit to a scheme without more study. Julian had let the matter rest. He pushed open the library door and found Charlotte already there. She was seated at the long table with the survey open before her, and beside it lay a sheet of her own paper, covered in notes. Gradients he saw as he came nearer, and cost estimates, and a rough sketch of the field's eastern boundary with the proposed channel marked in pencil. She looked up without startlement, and after the briefest hesitation, did not close the papers. He sat down across from her and asked a question, not a test. He was aware of the distinction even as he framed the words, aware that every question he had asked her since their wedding had carried some concealed measure beneath it. This was simply a question. What had made her begin with the upper gradient rather than the lower approach? She told him. She walked him through the reasoning with quiet, unhurried expertise. The soil composition along the eastern boundary, the fall of the land in wet weather, the cost difference between a shallow-cut channel maintained annually and a deeper cut that would require less attention over time. She had consulted, she mentioned, a survey of similar drainage work done in the neighbouring county some 15 years prior, the account of which was in the third shelf from the window if he wished to read it himself. He did not. He continued asking questions and she continued answering them, and at some point The conversation became less an explanation and more simply a conversation, two people working through a problem together, without ceremony, without the careful distance that had characterized every exchange between them until now. The better part of an hour passed. Neither of them marked its passing aloud. Julian became aware of the time only when the light through the long windows shifted toward afternoon, and he found himself looking at the notes she had made, the careful, penciled lines, the columns of figures, and understanding that she had done this work without being asked, without expectation of acknowledgement, simply because the problem was there, and she was capable of addressing it. He thought of the ledgers. He thought of Mrs. Ellard's unguarded warmth and of a kitchen maid's name spoken with genuine concern. He did not say any of this. He thanked her for the explanation and rose and replaced the survey on its shelf, and Charlotte gathered her notes together without fuss, and they parted at the library door with the ordinary civility of people who share a house. But something had shifted, quietly, and without announcement, in the way he held the knowledge of her. And though he did not yet have words for what it was, he found he was no longer certain that the words he had arrived with were the right ones. There is a particular quality of stillness that belongs only to women who have learned to want nothing from anyone who has not yet chosen to give it. Charlotte Reeve possessed this quality in the way that Marwood Hall possessed its old stone walls, not as an ornament, not as armour, but simply as the substance of which she was made. She did not seek Colonel Lord Marwood's company. She did not soften her voice when he was near, did not angle her conversation toward topics likely to please him, did not allow the smallest performance of warmth to enter her manner where no genuine warmth had yet been invited. She continued, day by day, to be precisely herself, measured, unhurried, capable and wholly unconcerned with the impression she was making upon a man who had spent weeks cataloguing her every movement for signs of treachery. Julian watched this and found he could not look away. He had known women who charmed as a matter of survival, who softened and brightened and tilted their faces toward approval, the way flowers tilt toward available light. He understood that impulse. He had seen what the absence of approval cost people in the world they both inhabited, but Charlotte did not tilt. She stood, unhurried, wherever the morning found her, and let whatever light there was fall as it would. He began to understand, slowly, and not without resistance, that what he had read as coldness was not coldness at all. It was dignity. She had accepted a situation she had not chosen in a house that was not yet a home, beside a stranger who watched her as though waiting for her to fail, and she had chosen, quietly, entirely without announcement, not to diminish herself within it. He thought of the journal entry. He thought of it often now, though he had read it only once and wished, some mornings, that he had not read it at all. She had written of him with such plain and sorrowful hope. She hoped he was not too unhappy to let kindness in eventually. She had written that of him, while he was standing in doorways counting her candles, while he was questioning the housekeeper in corridors, while he was watching her trace river routes on an atlas and constructing, from her careful attention, an architecture of suspicion that collapsed the moment he sat down with an old gardener and asked a single honest question. She had hoped for his happiness. She had named, without bitterness, the very quality he was withholding from her. And then she had locked the journal away in a drawer with a pressed flower and a miniature of her mother, and gone about her days as though the hoping itself were enough. One evening in the second week of December, he found her in the small sitting room beside the fire. A book lay open on her knee, something with a cloth binding he did not recognize, and the single candle on the table beside her threw a warm and unsteady light across the page. She did not look up when he entered. She was not performing absorption, she was simply absorbed, in the way of a person for whom a book is genuine company and not a prop arranged for the benefit of observers. Julian sat in the chair on the other side of the hearth. He had not intended to. He had meant to collect a letter from the mantelpiece and withdraw, but the room was warm, and the fire had settled into a low and steady burn, and he sat down without quite deciding to, the way one sometimes sits when the body is wiser than the will. Charlotte looked up then, not with surprise and not with welcome that sought to draw him in and make him grateful for his own arrival. She simply noted he was there, the way one notes the settling of a log in the grate, a quiet alteration in the room, neither unwelcome nor requiring remark. Then she reached out without comment and moved the candle several inches toward his side of the table. It was a small thing. It was, in every measurable sense, a very small thing. A candle moved across a few inches of polished wood in silence, without expectation of acknowledgement. He did not acknowledge it. She did not wait for him to. She returned to her book as though nothing had occurred, because in her accounting, nothing had. She had seen that the light did not reach him, and she had improved it, and that was all. He did not speak. He did not have words that seemed adequate or honest, or that would not have required him to explain a great deal. He was not yet ready to explain. She did not require him to speak. The fire breathed its slow heat into the room, and December pressed its dark and frost-cold weight against the windows, and the silence between them, which had been for weeks a silence full of watchfulness and guardedness and the careful management of distance, was, for the first time, something other than cold. Marwood Hall held them both, stone and shadow, and the long memory of empty rooms, and did not hurry them toward anything at all. The storm arrived without announcement, as storms in that part of England often did, a low and iron-coloured sky pressing itself against the long windows of Marwood Hall through the whole of the afternoon until, by the time the candles were lit and the supper-cloth laid, there was no question of the formal dining-room with its echoing distance and its 12 empty chairs. The housekeeper, without being asked, set 2 covers in the small sitting-room beside the fire, and Charlotte came down to find the table already placed, the curtains already drawn against the rattling dark, and the room contracted by lamplight to something almost intimate. She did not remark upon it. She took her chair, poured the wine when the footman withdrew, and let the fire speak for a time in the language of settling coals, and the low complaint of wind finding its way beneath the outer doors. Lord Marwood sat across from her and ate with the methodical quietness that she had come to understand was not indifference, but a form of inward discipline, as though he rationed his attention and was careful where he spent it. It was after the plates had been cleared and the decanter left between them that he spoke. He did not begin with an introduction or a softening remark. He said that his posting on the continent in the 2 years following the peace had not been a soldier's work. It had been quieter than that, and in certain ways more demanding of a kind of trust that soldiering rarely required. He had been attached to a diplomatic commission, the details he named without elaboration, and the work had depended upon a small number of men whose discretion and loyalty formed the entire architecture of what they were attempting to do. He spoke of 2 of them. He did not give their names. He watched the fire while he spoke, his voice level, his hands still upon the arms of his chair, and Charlotte watched him and said nothing. He said that information had been passed, that it had been passed more than once carefully and by someone who knew which particulars would cause the most damage, that lives had been lost as a consequence, not on a battlefield where such losses wore a kind of sanction, but in the particular and private way that unmade people quietly, without ceremony, without any accounting that could be put before the public record. He described none of this directly. He did not itemize the harm, but the shape of it was present in the room between them as plainly as the fire's heat, and Charlotte felt the weight of it settle without requiring explanation. He stopped speaking. The storm moved against the windows with a sound like a river running close. A coal shifted and fell, and the flame above the grate brightened briefly, gilding the side of his face, the scar at his jaw, the fixed and inward quality of his gaze. She waited until she was certain he was finished. She did not offer comfort in a hurry, did not lean toward him with the eager impulse to make the silence lighter. She had learned in the week since his return that there were silences in Marwood Hall that were heavier on one side than the other, and that the appropriate response was not always sound. When she did speak, she said it plainly, without rehearsal, that the kind of trust which had been described to her, earned by proximity and maintained over time and extended at considerable personal cost, did not mend itself by wishing once it had been broken. That a person might choose in time to extend a new trust, differently shaped and built upon different ground, but the original thing, the thing that had been taken and misused, did not return simply because one desired it to. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say she understood entirely. She said only what she believed to be true, in the quiet and unperformed way that she said most things. He turned his head then and looked at her. It was not the glance of a man conducting an assessment or the practiced neutrality with which he had in the early weeks managed every exchange between them. It was something else, fuller than that, and less guarded, and more costly, the look of a man who has been in a room with someone for some time and has, without quite deciding to, begun to see them clearly. He held her gaze for a long moment while the wind moved in the chimneys and the candle on the table between them bent and steadied. "No," he said, "it does not." The fire burned on, the storm pressed at the glass. Marwood Hall held them both in its old stone quiet, patient as it had always been patient, waiting for its rooms to fill again with something worth keeping warm. The morning came in pale and still, the kitchen garden lying dormant beneath a sky the colour of old pewter, the rose beds bare and dark against the frost-hardened earth. It was Julian who asked. He found Charlotte in the small sitting-room after breakfast, her shawl already about her shoulders, a book open in her lap, though she had not been reading it, and he said, quietly, that he wondered whether she might walk with him, if the cold did not discourage her. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that was not quite the colonel, not quite the lord of the house, something more ordinary and more careful. She said she did not mind the cold. They went out through the passage door and into the grey air, and their breath rose in small, quiet clouds as they followed the path between the dormant beds. The gravel was hard underfoot. The espaliered fruit trees along the kitchen wall spread their bare arms in patterns that had taken decades to arrange, and Charlotte found herself looking at them, because it was easier than looking at him, though she was aware of him beside her, his stride shortened to match her own. He did not speak at once. They walked the length of the first bed in silence, and then he stopped, and she stopped with him. facing the rose canes that stood stripped of everything soft, reduced to their bare essential structure, waiting. He said, "I opened your writing desk." He said it plainly without preface or softening, and the words hung in the cold air between them. He had obtained the key, he said, from Mrs. Ellard, under a pretext he was not proud of. He had gone to the desk while she was at church one Sunday 3 weeks past, and he had gone through what was there. His voice was level, but something in it was not comfortable, and he did not look away from the rose canes when he spoke. Charlotte said nothing. She drew her shawl a little closer and waited. He said that he had found letters, correspondence with her mother, with a cousin in Bath, with her former governess. He had found her mother's portrait in miniature oval in a cracked leather case. He had found her journal, and he had read one entry. One, he said, with a precision that felt like penance, before he understood what he was doing and set it down. He found, he said, precisely what he should have known was there. The voice of a woman conducting her life carefully and honestly in circumstances she had not chosen. Nothing that resembled what he had half feared to find, and he did not say aloud what he had feared. He said he was ashamed, and he said he was sorry. He said it without performance, without the flourish of a man seeking absolution, without the lowered eyes and elaborate remorse that might have made it easier to dismiss. He simply said it standing beside the dormant roses in the December cold, and then he was quiet. The silence lasted long enough that a sparrow moved in the wall somewhere above them, a small dry flutter, and then stillness again. Charlotte looked at the canes. They were severe and particular in their bareness, each one a record of what had been there before and what would come again, in time. She thought of the journal entry he had read. She did not know which one, and she did not ask. She thought of her mother's portrait in its cracked case, which she had not opened herself in several weeks, and of the letters folded in their careful order. She thought of what it was to have one's private things handled by someone who did not yet know what to make of her. Then she said, "I wondered whether you might, eventually." Her voice was even. She was not performing calm. She was simply calm, in the way of someone who had already, privately, arrived at the far side of a thing and waited there. There was no reproach in it. She did not ask what he had hoped to find, and she did not ask whether he was satisfied, and she did not make him explain himself further. She gave him the plainness he had given her, and no more, and no less. He turned his head to look at her then. She felt it rather than saw it, her own gaze still resting on the bare canes, on the intricate patience of them. After a moment he said, "You are more generous than I deserve." She considered this. She said, "I am not certain generosity is the word. I simply do not find much use in making it larger than it is." They stood a moment longer. The cold was present, but not cruel, and the garden was very quiet around them, enclosed by its old walls, held in the particular suspension of a December morning when nothing is yet required of the world. The silence that had settled between them was not the silence of avoidance, nor the silence of an unhealed wound. It was more like the ground itself, the cold, dark, patient earth beneath the beds, which held the roots of things through the season when everything visible had withdrawn and asked nothing of anyone, and waited. January came to Marwood Hall as it always did, without announcement, without ceremony, settling instead into the stones of the house like a long-held breath finally released. The frost arrived first in the kitchen garden, whitening the bare soil between the dormant rose canes, and then it moved inward, tracing fine needlework across the library windows each night, and leaving it there until mid-morning, when the pale winter sun at last persuaded it to retreat. The house itself seemed older in January, quieter, as though the cold had drawn it further into itself and bidden it to wait, and Marwood Hall, which had always known how to wait, obliged without complaint. Charlotte had not planned to begin walking the grounds in the early mornings, neither, she suspected, had Julian. Yet, on the third morning of the new year, she had gone out at 7 o'clock with her wool cloak drawn close and her breath clouding before her, and when she reached the turning beside the yew hedge, she found him already there, his greatcoat unbuttoned at the collar, watching a single crow navigate the frozen sky. He had fallen into step beside her, without remark. She had not remarked upon it either. The following morning he was at the door when she came downstairs, and by the end of the week it had become a thing they did, not agreed upon, not named, simply arrived at, the way that small, true habits sometimes form in the space where neither person is performing anything at all. They spoke on these walks, and they did not speak, and both were comfortable in either. He told her once about the January he had spent in Brussels after the war, the particular quality of cold in a city still learning what peace required of it. She told him about the January her father died, how the elm by the church gate had been stripped utterly bare, and she had fixed her eyes upon it during the burial because bare things, she had found, are easier to look at steadily than dressed ones. He did not offer a consolation, he listened, and then he said that he understood that, and she believed him. On the second Sunday of the month he accompanied her to the village church for the first time. He sat beside her in the cold pew with his hat in his hands and his eyes forward, and if the congregation noted his presence and found it remarkable, they were too well bred to show it plainly. Afterward, as they walked the lane home through air that smelled of frost and old wood smoke, he suggested they stop at Emile's cottage. The old man was delighted and produced a new letter from his granddaughter in Normandy, the handwriting very small, and the French very rapid. Julian read it slowly, his brow furrowed in earnest concentration, mispronouncing 2 words in a way that made Emile correct him, with great gentleness and evident pleasure. Together, the 3 of them composed a reply, Julian writing in a careful hand what Emile dictated, and Charlotte supplying the phrase when Julian's vocabulary failed him, which it did several times, candidly and without embarrassment. Charlotte did not remark aloud on how much had changed. It was not in her nature to offer such observations, and she suspected it was not in his nature to receive them comfortably, so she kept them quietly in herself instead, the way one keeps a good thing, not hoarded, only tended. What she noticed was this, that he no longer scanned a room when he entered it and found her already present. In November and December the habit had been so constant, she had stopped seeing it, the way one stops seeing a draught from a door that has always been ill-fitting. Its absence now had the mild, pleasant quality of a draught stopped, not a dramatic warmth, simply the removal of a small, persistent cold. That evening she set the candle on his side of the table without thinking about it. It was the better candle, the taller one, the one that would last past 10 o'clock, and she put it where it would serve him and moved her own chair slightly so that she was not quite in his light. He sat down, opened the volume he had been reading for several evenings, a history of the Iberian campaigns, dense with place names she did not know, and said nothing. She opened her own book. The fire settled. Outside, the frost was assembling itself again against the glass in its patient, intricate way, and the house breathed around them, cold and enduring and large, and within it the room was small, and the light was small, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying. It was not happiness arrived, precisely. Or rather, it was not the happiness of arrival, which always carries in it the noise of having got somewhere at last. It was quieter than that. It was something with the quality of a root that is found beneath the frozen surface of a January garden, the exact depth of soil it requires, not flourishing yet, not in any hurry to flourish, but held and real, and not going anywhere at all.